Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is The Hidden Risk Are Line Managers Failing Whistleblowers. For any of you who haven't joined us before, there is a chat function on the right-hand side of the screen. Please do add any questions as we go through, and we'll either pick them up as we go through or we'll have a time for questions at the end. So please ask. No question is a bad question, so ask us anything that you want to know, and we'll try our best to answer it. So I'm Jo Lewis. I am the Managing Director of Safecall, and I'm joined by Eve Maxwell, who's our Head of Training. Eve's got a lot of experience in HR, learning and development, and psychology, and is going to tell us all about this topic today. So Eve, The Hidden Risk Are Line Managers Failing Whistleblowers. It's quite a thought-provoking title. So is this a worry? Should we be worried about this, and why?
It can be a worry. It depends what your organisation is doing to mitigate this risk, really. If you think about line managers, they're really the unsung heroes of an organisation, and they're often juggling demands from people above them, from their leaders, but they're also juggling demands from employees and the people that report into them. So they've got a really busy job, and they're kind of the glue that holds everything together. But often line managers are promoted into position because they're really good at something. So they might have a particular skill or a particular forte, and then they end up being so good at that, they get promoted. The difficulty is that when often not preparing managers for that role. And if you think about being a people manager, it's a totally different skill set. It's a totally different way of working. And there's very, very few people who are naturally good people managers. We've all got to learn. We've all got to, make the mistakes. We've all got to, develop those skills. And when it comes to whistleblowing, it's really important that our managers are prepared for a situation where if an individual comes to them and they're speaking out about something they've seen, some sort of misconduct or wrongdoing, they know how to deal with that effectively. Because if they don't, there's a real risk to the organisation with that.
Brilliant. So our understanding, Eve, is that about 3/4 of employees will go to their line managers in the first instance if they're wanting to speak about something that they think is not not right within the organisation. So before we kind of go into all of the stats in a bit more detail, it would be really interesting to hear from our audience as to whether or not that's something that they're seeing, and whether it's that kind of percentage within your organisations. The poll is anonymous, so please don't worry. We won't know who's saying what, but we'd be really interested to hear from you. So hopefully that's live. I can't see it on my screen, but hopefully that is live.
I can see it.
Brilliant. I wonder why I can't see it. Well, in which case, Eve, because I can't see it, you'll need to talk us through the results when they come through.
Oh, at the moment, it's really, really mixed bag. So we've got it's changing all the time. Hang on, I'll give it a minute.
In real time.
In real time. It's a move above.
I can see it now.
So we've got 16% of line managers dealing with concerns about malpractice or misconduct on a weekly basis. So that's really quite often. We've got 32% on a monthly basis, 32% a few times a year, and 21% less than a year. So we've got, and nobody's not dealing with it. So we've got 0% never. So it's a really, really mixed bag. I mean, the good thing, to take away from this, really, if you've got 3/4 of employees going to their line manager in the first instance, that really does tell us something about the trust and the relationship between employees and managers. They're the people that they feel comfortable going to, they feel safe to go to, and that's really, really good. But looking at those figures there, we've got some managers that are, dealing with things all the time, dealing with concerns all the time. And then we've got other managers who, it's once in a blue moon. It's less than once a year. And you know what it's like, the things that you're dealing with all the time, you feel very confident with, but the things that crop up every once in a while, you sometimes need a little bit of a refresher to know what to do. So this is a really interesting set of results.
I think it's a great point that you make about kind of trust, because as you say, it's great to see, and it's logical, right, that if you've got trust in your line manager, that would probably be your first port of call. But I imagine, and having, been a line manager myself, that sort of, I guess, responsibility that you've got when somebody does come to you and speak to you about making sure that you manage that in the right way, making sure that, they feel positive about that experience, because it takes a lot of courage to have those conversations. It can't be underestimated, really, can it? So it's really interesting to see that nobody said 0% there. All line managers and all the organizations that have joined us today are receiving concerns. And like you said, some people are doing that very regularly as part of the day job, and some much less regularly. So I'm just going to go to the next slide and hand over to you, Eve, to talk a little bit more about this.
Yeah. So this piece of research really caught my eye. It came out just in the last couple of weeks. Gallup do this huge survey every year looking at sort of employee engagement and what's going on around the world. And they found that last year, global employee engagement really did fall. And this costs us money because, employees aren't engaged, they're putting in less effort, all of those things. And they sort of pinpointed the reason for this fall in engagement as being a fall in manager engagement. So if your manager's not engaged, if your manager isn't, putting everything into doing a good job, then your employees aren't going to be doing that as well. So it has a bit of a trickle down effect. And when we're thinking about line managers, really, if we want them to feel engaged, if we want them to feel that they can cope with the demands of their role, this is about making sure they've got the right sort of resources. And that can be things like training, it can be guidance, it can be support. And in the whistleblowing world, when we're thinking about managers, we really need them to know very basic things about, do we, can they spot, a protected disclosure if someone came to them? Do they know the best way to respond? Do they know the legislation? All of the things that we would want them to know to be able to feel comfortable and confident and competent to deal with a whistleblowing concern.
Brilliant. Go on to the next slide, Eve, so you can talk a bit about the stats.
Yeah, so this is quite an interesting one. So, thinking about looking at the stats here, we've got a bit of a mixed bag again. It's not quite the same figures, but actually quite similar to some of our figures today. So you can see there that 17% of managers are dealing with misconduct concerns on a weekly basis. This really chimes with what we found this morning with 16%. So we've got a proportion of managers that are dealing with misconduct quite regularly, actually. And then we've got other managers that are dealing with it just a few times a year. So again, we're seeing that little bit of a mix up. So some organizations are getting more of those concerns coming through. Other organizations, it's again once in a blue moon. So the good news, like I said before, the good news is that this is a great indication of trust. We've got people coming forward and feeling safe to speak up. And I think what's really important is that the support for line managers keeps pace with what we're expecting managers to do. So if they are dealing with demands, dealing with those concerns quite regularly, that's brilliant. But if as long as they feel confident, if they feel comfortable, and they feel equipped to deal with those concerns, for those people that are doing it once in a blue moon, it's really important that if they're, to keep up the awareness, to keep drip feeding, this is what you do, keep raising that awareness as well.
Totally agree. And it's interesting from the stats that we saw before on the poll that here we've got 9% of organisations saying that the line managers never have to deal with a concern. But today, our audience have all got line managers dealing with concerns, so it's particularly topical. So what are the risks then, Eve? You know, if you've got employees, a large percentage, 77% of employees bringing their concerns to their line managers, what are the potential consequences then of not having the right amount of training and not dealing with them properly?
Well, there are, organisations have a legal obligation to, protect people who speak up about misconduct. So the first real worry is that, when, those whistleblowers aren't being protected, which, has two major effects really. If you're not protecting your whistleblower, you've got that loss of trust. It's going to have an impact on that employee, and other people within that team are going to see that impact. So it's going to have a ripple effect throughout your organization, and you definitely don't want that. You don't want that loss of trust. You want employees to feel like they can speak up, because if you think about whistleblowing, it's really part of the checks and balances of your organization. We want people to be coming to us if they see something like fraud or criminal behavior. We don't want that to be hidden, under the rug and to get worse and worse and worse. So there's that risk, but there's also the risk of, if you're not protecting your employee, there's the risk of employment tribunal as well. So you've got the, all of the time and the resource and money you spend preparing for an employment tribunal, then potential risk of fines, and you've also got sort of reputational risk as well. And we don't have to look too far in terms of newspaper headlines to see some of our some well-known organisations getting whistleblowing wrong and it hitting the headlines as well. So you've got the sort of monetary risk, but you've also got the risk of reputational damage as well. So, there's lots of reasons to make sure that your line managers are equipped with the knowledge and skills they need.
And I think it's interesting because, you've talked about a real range of concerns that could be raised. And I think that's the point really, that, a line manager could hear about something that's perhaps more of a grievance, and then also, something that is a protected disclosure. And it's really important for them to be able to recognise the differences between those things, because as you say, they need to be handled perhaps in a slightly different way. But regardless, the trust that the employee has put into raising that concern can be quite quickly eroded if it's not, dealt with in the right way. And, one of the key sort of costs to an organisation, both financially and from a culture perspective, is if people lose confidence and then perhaps they leave, and then they have to find a new person. So I think there's just lots of kind of potential ramifications for getting this wrong. And I think what we're not saying is that there's any, those line managers are acting with their best, putting their best foot forward on this. It's just when they haven't been given that requisite training and understanding of what they need to do, then obviously mistakes can happen. So I'll pop on to the next slide because we've got some interesting additional, and I can see the questions coming in the chat. And we'll pick them up. There's a particular point, Fabio, when we talk about your point, so I will come on to that shortly. But yes, I'll let Eve carry on talking about employment tribunal statistics.
Oh, yeah, we're a little bit of, well, I am a bit of a nerd when it comes to looking at employment tribunals because it's fascinating reading, and I know I should find myself a better hobby, but employment tribunal statistics, these are some really interesting findings that came out. The Ministry of Justice publishes information about employment tribunals, and this set of figures is from 2023 to 2024. So the number of claims has risen by 13% in 2024. So we're becoming more litigious. We're seeing more claims coming through employment tribunals. So that's the first thing. The second thing is just to have a look at some of these figures. So this was the highest award for an unfair dismissal claim in 2024. It's nearly £180,000. And this is a scenario where the award has been uncapped. So it's like, well, whistleblowing has an uncapped award. So if you fall foul of whistleblowing, you don't protect your whistleblower, this is the sort of money we're talking about. So it's not to be, taken lightly. If you compare it to the average award for unfair dismissal, the median award there is £6,746. The mean is £13,749. So you can see there's a big difference between an ordinary, I don't want to say ordinary, but just a capped employment tribunal case and something that is a whistleblowing case. So in terms of, your organization needs to have a way of spotting early on which of these disclosures might be whistleblowing disclosures, protected disclosures, so that we're not running that risk of getting it wrong and ending up paying an awful lot of money out if it did end up going to an employment tribunal.
And like we said, I mean, yes, the stats are quite eye-opening, but as we said before, it's really not just the financial implications, is it, Eve?
No, because I'm not the only person that looks at employment tribunal cases. These make great headlines. I'm sure we've all seen cases where it's splashed in various newspapers about this company or that company who have ended up having to have a huge payout because they haven't got whistleblowing right.
Indeed. So we've talked a little bit about kind of, people going to line managers and whether those line managers are going to be able to and trained properly to deal with those disclosures. So let's talk a little bit now about what the stats from the recent survey that we did are telling us. And let me just move on to the next slide, because we have got some information there to support some of the things that we're saying.
Yeah, so let's have a little look at what's happening. We've got these stats are based on a recent survey that we ran in collaboration with People Management magazine. So we pulled 249 HR leaders, and they were from a range of different organizations, both large and small. And we wanted to really understand how often managers were dealing with concerns and how confident managers were, and also about the training that managers were receiving. So we know from our previous slide that 68% of line managers are addressing whistleblowing concerns at least once a year, and 17% are dealing with concerns weekly. I find these, as a sort of L&D person, I find these stats a little bit concerning because have managers received specific training on whistleblowing legislation? Only 28% have, which for me is a big worry, because you want your line managers to be able to first of all recognize a protected disclosure and then deal with that effectively and manage that effectively. So that is a little bit of a concern. And of those people that said, of those 28% that said that managers did receive specific whistleblowing, specific training on whistleblowing legislation, how often is this training being delivered? And you can see there that there's only 34% who are having that delivered annually. And again, this is a little bit of a concern, particularly when we know that whistleblowing legislation is likely to be updated and change in the coming years. Our current government have made a huge commitment to protecting workers' rights. We've got the Employment Rights Bill on the horizon. We're expecting is to see some changes in whistleblowing legislation coming about as a result of that. So what I would say, if you're sitting watching this now thinking, oh, how often should we do this training? It's important to do it regularly so that people are keeping on top of what the legislation is and what your organisation's legal obligations are as well.
I think that's a really good point, because we're only seeing legislation that's strengthening the protection for employees in general. I mean, we saw, the Worker Protection Act came into force in October last year with regards to sexual harassment. And, as you know, Eve, we've had lots of conversations with clients around kind of what the impact of that is. How do they strengthen their whistleblowing function to make sure that they're, adhering to that act, but also kind of protecting people from that perspective. The employee rights bill talks about making sexual harassment a protected disclosure. So I think, we're not saying that everybody needs to be an expert in legislation, but I think there's probably some key things that all managers should be aware of. And I think, that's probably more the appropriate sort of level that we're talking about, really, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's about knowing what the legislation means to you. So as a line manager, this is what the legislation is. What do you need to take away from that, really? So, they don't, we're not expecting line managers to be on top of every single, piece of legislation related to their role, but it's about, what are the key messages they need to take away, and bear in mind, if they do have an employee come to them who's raising a concern about something that sits within those categories of misconduct in the whistleblowing legislation.
Absolutely. Great. Well, it'd be great to hear from our audience again here to understand whether you have a similar experience to what we're seeing here on the slide. So if you could answer the poll and let us know about the management training within your organisation, please. And remember, it is anonymous. Whilst we're waiting for that, Angela, you've asked what is captured under protected disclosures. Off the top of my head, because I'm not a legal expert, I wouldn't feel confident telling you them all. I don't know, Eve, whether you would be able to rattle off all of the protected disclosures.
Oh, yes. So the key thing for protected disclosure is that it is something that is in the public interest. So it's something that's affecting more than that individual. So, it's things like financial misconduct, so things like fraud, theft, criminal offences would sit under that too. Health and safety is another big one, because if you think about, the effect of having poor health and safety within the workplace, it can affect, employees, it can affect customers, it can affect wider society. Pollution and damage to the environment is another key thing. So we see a lot of headlines about things like fly tipping and pollution of the rivers. That's a sort of whistleblowing area as well. And covering up wrongdoing. So if an organisation is aware that there is something going on and they either fail to act or they sweep it under the rug, that's also a whistleblowing area as well. But the interesting thing is with the Public Interest Disclosure Act is, we strongly suspect that there'll be things added to that, like prevention of sexual harassment, for example. So it's worth, we're saying this is the legislation at the moment, but it's likely to change. But the other thing that you need to bear in mind that with the protected disclosure, there are some real grey areas. So if someone comes to you in, with something like harassment, you might think, oh, that's just affecting that individual. But it could be something that's more widespread across your organisation, which would bring in that public interest element to it. So within your organisation, it's worth thinking about how you are monitoring and reviewing the concerns that are coming through, because being able to spot patterns is really important, and it, in terms of spotting things that might possibly be public interest protected disclosures.
That's a really interesting point, Eve. So would you then suggest if something was raised where it's unclear, like the point you just made there, whether it is a protected disclosure or not, would you then advise that people treat it as such until they're sort of sure?
Oh, absolutely. I think if you look, even just looking at that slide on Employment Tribunal stats, there is a bigger risk to your organisation for getting a protected disclosure wrong than there is, getting a grievance wrong, say, for example. So, if you're not sure, err on the side of caution and really do treat it like a protected disclosure. But it's a good thing if you have within your organisation, when it comes to triage, somewhere that line managers can go to get that bit of advice as well, and to have that clearly in your policy and your procedures, so that your line managers are supported and they know where to go if they need that bit of help with triage, and I think it's just making sure that you've got things in place, not just training, but things in place to support your line managers more widely.
Brilliant. Thank you, Eve. And I think it's really interesting looking at these results because they sort of mirror, in fact, slightly higher in terms of the percentage of people that haven't been trained at all, but mirroring pretty much what we saw from the survey that we did, which, we won't kind of go over all the reasons why we think it's important that people are trained again, but obviously gives you a bit of food for thought, I suppose, around, your own organizations and perhaps how you might go about addressing those things. There's lots of different options there. So actually, I'm going to go on to the next slide, Eve, and I've preempted you because on the next slide we were going to talk about protected disclosures, but you've just done a great job of it. But we talked about the skills that line managers need. We're saying they need to be trained, but what exactly do we mean by that? What skills do we think are important for those line managers to handle the concerns appropriately?
Well, if there are lots of things,
and I'd be amazed if anyone can read that slide, because even with my glasses on I can't, so you might have to call it out.
So what you really need from training, first of all, your managers need to know what the legislation is, and not just what the legislation is in a dry sort of way, but what it means to them, what they need to take away from it. So this is also about knowing your organisation's legal obligations. What do you need to do around whistleblowing to make sure that you're protecting your employees from detriment? So there's the protected disclosure and the legislation piece, and that's the sort of knowledge bit. But what you also want your managers to have are some of those, I was going to say soft skills, but they're not soft skills. Soft skills are actually really hard. It's things around how to create the right sort of culture within their team so that people feel safe to come to them with concerns. And this is a sort of something that needs to be built up and things that managers need to think about. So it's creating that right sort of environment. What are they going to do? We're going to encourage people to speak up. What are they actually going to do when people do speak up? So what's the best way to respond? How are you going to protect that individual from detriment or retaliation? How are you going to support that individual? So it's a mix of knowing what's required legally, but also as a manager, what you are practically going to do in the scenario if someone comes to you with a concern.
Brilliant. So is there anything kind of in there that you wanted to expand upon? I mean, do you feel that line managers generally have these skills?
Well, I think it's, in my experience, it's a mixed picture. And I think this is really reflected in what we found from the survey as well. So, if we have a look at some of these figures, out of the HR leaders that we surveyed, 55% of them felt confident that their line managers knew how to encourage people to speak up, and 41% believed that they knew how to respond when concerns were raised. So, line managers are I wouldn't say 55% and 41% are particularly high, but we've got a good proportion of managers that have those skills to be able to get employees to talk to them, which is great. We've got over half of the respondents did not believe their managers understood what a protected disclosure was. For me, that's ringing alarm bells, because if you can't identify protected disclosure from the outset, how on earth are you going to manage it properly? So there's a risk there. 46% didn't believe that line managers understood the whistleblowing legislation, and less than a third were confident that their line managers knew how to protect whistleblowers from detriment, which is another alarm bell ringing. And 58% weren't confident that line managers were following whistleblowing policy and procedure. And for me, that's a big alarm, because a lot of organisations, they have a whistleblowing policy or a speak up policy, and that's great, and they've put a great deal of effort into developing that policy and the processes. But if people aren't aware of that policy, if people aren't following that policy, that is another risk, because when we're thinking about, if you were to end up in something like an employment tribunal, if you were to end up in that awful situation, it doesn't show your company in a good light if you're not following your own processes and policies. So any training as well needs to include, what your organization's policy is, and it's signposting that, and it's saying, as a line manager, this is what you do if someone comes to you with a concern. So it's making sure that people are really clear on that. And I think there's lots that line managers can do. I think organizations are very good at coming up with, policies and saying, this is what we're doing as an organization. Really, line managers need to be amplifying that. So the tone from the top is really important. The stance on whistleblowing is really important. We want people to come forward, we want people to speak up, but actually the tone from the middle is just as crucial. So it's up to line managers as well to be communicating those messages around whistleblowing, around, speaking up, and we want you to speak up. And line managers are really uniquely positioned to be able to create those safe spaces where people do come forward with their concerns around things like misconduct or wrongdoing.
And you said before that the employment tribunals take a pretty dim view on kind of some of this stuff, and I think that's been also sort of backed up by the experience that we've had, because, as you know, we've got our investigators are very senior former police officers who support some of our clients with their outsourced investigations, and a lot of the time they're seeing these similar trends in the investigations that they're being asked to support with, where perhaps internally that experience hasn't been isn't available, so so they're having to get involved and support, which is fine. But I think there's a plethora of things that organizations can do to equip themselves really well. So just moving on to the next slide then, because we asked the HR leaders about, how confident they felt that employees would feel safe to report workplace misconduct or malpractice to their managers. And this is an area at Safecall that we're really passionate about. We want people to feel safe to speak up in their workplace environment and have kind of a belief that is the right thing to do, and that will be treated appropriately, and that they will get a good positive outcome from having spoken up. So it's interesting here to see that really only about half of the people, the HR leaders that were surveyed, felt just over half, because we got very confident and quite confident, felt that they would, feel safe to speak up to their managers. So it's good that it is over 50%, but it does show that there are still people there feeling as though that they wouldn't be confident. So I think it's probably a good point to address Craig's question, which was, what's the single most important thing people can, let me get the exact words, Craig, so I don't misquote you. What's the single most effective change an organisation can make to support whistleblowers? I've been thinking about this, and I don't think there is one thing. I
No.
think that, you know, unfortunately, there's not a silver bullet here. I think it's about creating that sort of choice of a channel choice of how people can speak up. So I think line managers, as we've said, are a very kind of common place that people will go to first, and a really important part of that. And we've talked a lot about the need for those people to be trained appropriately for all the reasons we've already said. But I think it's really important to also offer other avenues for those employees if they don't feel confident. You know, there may be a conflict of interest. They might actually be needing to speak up about their line manager, in which case it obviously wouldn't be appropriate to use that channel. So that's why lots of our clients come to us, because we offer that independent approach where people can speak up without kind of, you know, being known to their organization. There may be other champions internally or HR, you know, there's lots of different options for how people can speak up, and it helps build that trust and confidence within the system. So certainly that would be one aspect that I would suggest. Eve, there's probably others that you would suggest as well.
I think this is a single thing, but it's the hardest thing to do, and it's about that culture. So creating that culture where people want to speak up, they feel safe to speak up, and they really trust that their organisation is going to do something about it. And if I was to pick another one single thing to do, I've probably got about 10 actually single things that you could do. It's around communication. So it's getting that message out that we want people to speak up. It's thanking whistleblowers. But I mean, whistleblowers, when they're thinking about speaking up about misconduct, are really concerned about two things. They're concerned about, you know, how is this going to affect me? Is there going to be negative repercussions on what are my colleagues going to think? Is that promotion out the window? So they're thinking about things on a personal level, but they're also worried about, you know, will speaking up make a difference? Will that organisation actually listen to what I've said and do something off the back of it, or is this totally pointless? You know, is it, you know, if I speak up about something, will anything happen? So I think communication around how to speak up, why it's important, but also that follow-up. So if someone does speak up, being able to say, you know, I mean, don't go into specifics, don't go into details, don't name names, but saying things like, you know, somebody came forward and told us about this. Thank you so much for that. This is what we've done as a result. And really showing that, you know, there is that transparency over what the whistleblowing is and what's done as a result. Because I think that's really important, that people can see that, you know, what they've said has made a difference. So communication for me, and culture and reporting channels. I don't know if there is such a single thing, but a lot of things.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think, you know, lots of our, I think less now, but, you know, historically clients perhaps would think it was a positive thing if they weren't getting loads of reports through the channel, because that must mean the culture's great and everything's wonderful. And that might be the case, but I think most organizations now recognize that, you know, getting those reports, whether they are pretty minor matters or really serious matters, is a really good thing, because it shows trust in the channels that you've employed, and to the point you're making there, that there's an awareness of how to speak up. And then, you know, that it gives the organization that opportunity to do something about it, which, as you say, is super important, because the minute people think that they're not being listened to or they're not being heard, then obviously that confidence is quite easily eroded. So it's hard to get to build that trust, and then quite easy to erode that trust. So really important to kind of, and you know, and even if the outcome is not what perhaps that person was wanting or looking for, at least they know that it's been looked at, it's been investigated properly, and, you know, a fair outcome has been reached. Great. Well, I'm just going to look at the questions as you work, because I've seen some more coming through. I want to see if they're about about anything that we. Yes, Graham's got a question, which is, when you're responding via platform, how much information should you provide as an overview when closing a case out? I think that's a really kind of it depends type answer from my perspective, because obviously it depends on what the matter is that you're investigating and what would be appropriate to share within that closing out of the case. Certainly within our channel, I think there's information that you choose to share with the whistleblower, and then obviously the information that you choose to kind of keep in your internal system to sort of document your findings. So I think that they're two slightly different things. What you choose to share as the outcome to that reporter can be different to kind of what you capture internally, and obviously what remediation actions that you put in place to rectify whatever has gone on. But I don't know, Eve, if you've got any sort of further thoughts on that.
I totally agree. I think you've got to bear in mind that you've got there's privacy issues as well. So it's about not oversharing information that you shouldn't really be sharing. I think probably the go-to is the thank you very much. We've investigated, we've taken action on your concern, and we appreciate you coming forward. I would be really, I would avoid giving too many details around the outcomes, really.
Agreed. And I think that's why when we see clients sort of talking and communicating with their workforce, it's much more often around themes rather than sort of specifics. So Craig also asks what areas of a company, I think, what departments typically manage whistleblowing responses in our experience. Again, it varies, I think, depending often on the size of the organization. So I think, often it's some organizations have a dedicated whistleblowing team that will manage whistleblowing matters. Often they're triaged, and if it's a HR matter, it will be managed by HR or legal and compliance as well. So it does tend to depend on the type of matter that's been raised. It'll be triaged and then sent to the team that's most capable and relevant to investigate it. And yeah, Graham, I think with the whistleblower, I understood the question. Yeah, with the whistleblower, I think it's about sharing, like we said, what's appropriate, and that will very much depend on the matter. A lot of the high percentage of the matters that are raised through our system are much more they're not protected disclosures. They tend to be grievances, and if they're investigated, then obviously you'd potentially share the information that's relevant with the whistleblower. If it's a protected disclosure, like Eve said, it may be not appropriate to share that information. So it's impossible, I think, to kind of be really specific about that without having a specific example to share. Before we come on to our last slide, and I'm really grateful for all the questions. It's great to have such a lot of audience engagement. Fabio asked the first question, and I wanted to wait to answer it until the right point in the webinar, which I think is now. So Fabio said, we sometimes get anonymous mails with concerns from addresses we don't know, but people that seem to be employees. How to react to such mails? Great question. And the whole kind of anonymity point is a really interesting one, because it's quite difficult to investigate without having enough details to investigate. Now, there are ways that systems can support that. So as an example, within our system, there's a two-way communications channel, so that if the report was raised anonymously, you could go and ask for more information to support what that report is about, and then try to investigate it. But it's really difficult if you, and this is one of the key things that clients say to us, which is, we have X percentage of anonymous reports, and because there's not enough information, we can't really take any further action. So it's about trying to find a channel that people can report anonymously, but that you can then have that communication to gain extra information so that you can appropriately investigate it. Eve, anything that you want to add to any of that?
No, that sounds
great.
Same, yeah.
I'm going to go forward to the next slide, and we will still answer questions. But we've talked a lot about, I guess, a lot of things on this webinar, but certainly with regards to managers and that kind of appropriate levels of training and support for managers. So any sort of key takeaways from you, Eve, that you wanted to sort of share with the audience before we finish?
Yeah, I think that the survey really highlighted to me that line managers are in positions of trust. Employees are coming to them with concerns, but maybe those line managers haven't had the benefit of training to help them understand what a protected disclosure is, to help them manage those concerns. So I think, one thing to really take away is, to have a look at manager training. Could it be strengthened? It's about making sure that you're confident that your managers know what whistleblowing is and know how to deal with it effectively, and also know that they should be following your process and your policy. The second thing is about really trying to foster that trust and that confidence and that belief that, if someone does speak up about misconduct, that the organisation will do something about it. So develop clear policies and procedures, but I have a slight caveat. Develop those clear policies and procedures and talk about them and, drip feed that information and keep bringing them up, because with the best will in the world, a lot of organizations have a shared area where they have all their policies, and there's tons of policies, and it's about making sure that people are aware of whistleblowing, and know what to do and know where to find the information if they need it, particularly those managers that are dealing with concerns once in a blue moon. So it's really important that they know where to go for guidance and support. Encouraging a speak up culture. So this is about really leaders and managers acting as role models. So it's encouraging people to come forward. It's, taking concerns seriously. And it's about the messaging around speaking up within your organisation. Monitoring and evaluating. We're really good. I think we're really, really good at coming up with policies, coming up with whistleblowing processes and saying, tick, well done, we've got it all sorted. The trick is to go back and monitor and see how things are going. Are your line managers following process and procedure? How do you know? Are your employees suffering a detriment? How do you know? Do employees know how to report wrongdoing? How do you know? So it's really getting that information to test and monitor the robustness of your whistleblowing arrangements. And the final thing, address training gaps. So, there might be some managers that are dealing with whistleblowing time and time again. They might still have gaps in their knowledge. You might have managers that are not dealing with whistleblowing that often, and they might have more gaps. So it's really about identifying what your organisation needs. And we were thinking about this before the webinar and thinking, what can we do to help? What can we do to support you? And we've come up with a tool that you can use, and we're very happy to send it to you if you're interested, to help you identify the gaps in line manager knowledge. So it's, what should they know? What do they know? And you can use that to really think about how to really address those training needs.
That's great. And I think probably worth mentioning as well that we do offer lots of different training around these subjects. If anything that we talked about today particularly resonates and you think you'd like to have a chat about it in a bit more detail, we offer lots of different training, from kind of training investigators to, Eve does some great courses around what managers should be listening up for, what their obligations are. And also we've just launched a new training course around sexual harassment, and the sexual harassment, it's based sort of on the Sexual Harassment Worker Protection Act, and we also offer e-learning. So I won't start reeling off all the things we offer, but if it's something that you feel that you want to have a further conversation, then please do get in touch. We'd love to support you on some of this stuff. Just a couple more questions actually in the chat, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. So Graham, again, thank you for your question. So what does an organisation do if they continue to receive the same allegations over and over that have been investigated but not fully substantiated and is likely to be from an aggrieved ex-employee? Do they just continue to close out the cases with the same response? great question. And I imagine that lots of our clients will do this in different ways. And that sounds like a bit of a sitting on the fence answer. But what I would say, Graham, is that we do offer sort of opportunities to join round tables and listen to what other, share best practice and listen to what other people do in this space. So if that's something, rather than Eve and I sort of talking about kind of what our clients do, if that's something that's of interest to you, again, get in touch with us, because we'd be really happy to invite you along to that. And you can hear from other organizations about how they address some of these things. Eve, anything from you on that point?
No.
And then the next question, I think, is definitely an Eve question from Robert, which is, what is the right cultural balance for senior managers to aim for between reputational risk management and employee confidence?
Oh, I think they're sort of tapping into the same thing, to be honest with you. When we're talking about if you have a culture where people do feel comfortable speaking up about misconduct, then you are minimising your risk. So, we won't hear if people are, if there's something criminal going on, if there's some sort of behaviour that would fit in that public interest disclosure category. You really, as senior leaders, you need to be leading that and getting that message out that this is something that you want to hear about, that's something that you're going to address, and that will help to really mitigate your risk. And that sort of messaging increases employee confidence and trust as well. The slight caveat, though, is that you've got to do what you say you're going to do. So if you say we're going to investigate whistleblowing, if you say this is our process and this is the timescale and this is what's going to happen, you need to make sure that you're following through on that, because as Joe said earlier, that trust in leaders can take a long time to build, and it can be fractured really, really quickly. So it's about, senior leaders, they have to lead from the front. They need to get that messaging out around whistleblowing. And that should improve employee confidence in this, but only if you're consistent in what you do and you do follow your processes.
That's great. Thank you, Eve. Well, we've covered off all the questions that were asked in the chat. So thanks so much for all of the engagement from the audience today. It's always nice when we get lots of questions. And I think it's a pretty interesting topic as well. That brings us to a close for today's session. We will be sharing the report that the stats were based on. So hopefully that will be of interest. I've noticed that a few of you are interested in the tool that Eve talked about, so we'll make sure that you get a copy of that as well. And as we said earlier, if there's any additional kind of support or information, please do reach out. You've got the email address there, or if you're a current client of Safecall, then please just reach out to your account manager and they'll be able to support you. So 7 minutes back, which is good news for the day. Great to see you all today, and look forward to hopefully seeing you on our next webinar. And thanks so much to you, Eve, as well.
Thanks.